one of the challenges with this is that because of the fire, I bet a fair number of folks are wondering what to do after the fire. And so we have an awful lot going on with fire recovery and assistance there. And that's really been dominating a lot of my time. I actually prepared this talk more about fire prevention and preparedness, like what to do to prepare for the next fire. And I don't have a lot of prepared stuff about how to help you recover from the fire that just burned. However, we have a whole lot that we're doing on that, and we have a series of webinars that we've recorded that you could access, and that's in the resource sheet that I'm providing on wildfire has links to that. We have a new OSU Extension Fire program, and all of our after the fire webinars and such are there. But I'm hopefully we'll have time for questions on that too. So let me see if I can get this thing to start up. Where did it go? I'm not seeing my mouse. Why isn't it giving me my mouse? There we go. Okay, so this talk I'm going to really focus on preparing for the next fire, or making your property and your home more resistant to fire, or changing fire behavior. And um, I do want you to tune in and get in touch with me about more help for after the fire. So let's bring that up in the questions too. So this particular focus here is just about helping you in reducing hazards and risks. I'm going to cover basics of wildfire and fire risk in our different forest types, and again, planning and preparedness and sources of assistance. Um, it's interesting. The last time I really focused on this was before the 2020 wildfires. In fact, Jenny and Sarah, you probably remember we had this programs in 2019, and we're really, trying to get people fired up and paying attention to wildfire preparedness. And then, to our horror, we weren't expecting the kind of fires that we had here on the west side, and a lot of them burn. This is just showing how many ignitions there are. This is just a 25-year period, and red is a human caused ignition and yellow is a lightning caused ignition. And the point being that fires are starting every year by the thousands. And what we do to be prepared for it, to either keep it from blowing up to being a catastrophic fire, or just to have the fire burn but not be as damaging as it moves through your property. That's what this is about, that I'm going to really focus on. And luckily, all of these dots didn't become a huge catastrophic fire. Very few of them did. But then when you look at the large fires, the ones that really did get out of hand and over 100 acres, and often now thousands or hundreds of thousands. This, by the way, is from the Oregon Wildfire Explorer website, which really gives you a lot of ways to look at fire and fire risk and fire occurrence. And that's in the resources and the references I posted. So this shows you the big fires, and the 2020 fires are the red and pink. And so this is 20 years of fire. You can see that before 2020, we didn't have a lot of big fires, certainly in the last 20 years on the west side in our more moist forests. But 2020 was the big blow up that we obviously just experienced. Of course, it's just to show how we do need to be prepared for fire, and what can we do to mitigate it so it's not so damaging when it comes. So this is focusing again on the 2020 fires, but if you look at those red dots that are human caused ignitions and the yellow dots that are lightning fires, it only took one of those to become each of these fires. I think there was a lightning ignition perhaps in one of these, and then human ignitions in two of them. And that one unfortunately became this huge fire because of the weather conditions. So it kind of goes back to what I had in my previous talk, is that, yeah, these forests that we live amongst or that we're establishing are in a environment that is driven by fire. So our historic woodlands in the Willamette Valley had frequent fires. The denser forests higher up in the mountains were much less frequent, because the probability of having the fuel be dry enough and having an ignition and having the weather conditions, those just didn't happen very often. But they do happen, as they just did in 2020. And so our bigger challenge here on the west side of the Cascades is that we have these high productivity forests. We accumulate a lot of fuels even over 30 or 40 years. And the fires don't happen very often, but when they do, then those conditions are ripe for it to be more destructive. So as in these examples, from going from a ground fire on the left to sporadic crown fires to just catastrophic crown fires, and even fires that don't even touch the ground, they just burn through the crowns as they're wind driven through the forest. So what can you do? The ultimate goal is first for all of us to realize that we live in a fire prone environment, even if they don't happen very often. But in the kinds of weather conditions we've had and the increasing amount of humans with accidents and sparks, maybe more often than in the past. So just understand and accept responsibility that we are in a fire prone environment, especially as we're out in the woods in our communities, and that we need to take action and be prepared and do that as individuals and as a community. So that's kind of the first part of my pitch here. But then as far as how you do that, um, there's going to be a lot more investment of time and effort and money and attention to being prepared for fire after this unfortunate wake-up call that we had. This is an example of the kind of organization that we tap into, where every county has a community wildfire protection plan. The agencies such as Department of Forestry, um, offices of emergency management, the fire marshals, the Forest Service, all these wildland fire agencies really team up and want to help us assess, where are the risks and what are the options in our communities where we live. So this is just an example of the Marion County Wildfire Protection Plan. Um, don't need to touch too much on that, where fires had occurred here in the last 10 years in this example. But then you look at zeroing in on your community. Are there resources? If you're identified as a higher hazard area, you may be higher on the list for getting help, for example, from various agencies and programs. So tuning into where you are with respect to that, and then what the risks are in your community. And, of course, the big question with fires like the Beachy Creek fire that started in the wilderness and burned for a long time, and then it got away, to deal with that as it entered, mixed ownership. How do we plan for that in the future? And this is just an example of what we're doing more of everywhere in the West these days, is really looking at a landscape level look at where are the hazards across federal land, state land, private land. How do we work together on both sides of the boundary to manage those risks and change the way the fire behaves when it comes, because it will come. So we're doing more and more of that. In fact, Extension, we just hired over the last year 6 new fire specialists to really help do projects like this, more at the 30 to 100,000 acre scale, and identifying every landowner and working together on assessing where the risks and hazards are and doing something to change that so that the fire will behave differently. That's harder to do here on the west side when things grow so fast, and we're going to talk more about that. So resources for you, for all of us, as well as our OSU Extension Education Program, which I will refer you to. It's in the handout that I posted. The OSU Fire Program has a lot of great resources online that'll tap you into this. A lot of recorded webinars, et cetera, reading material, examples, videos. But Firewise USA is also a great resource for that. And it's also a organizational hub where you can make your community a Firewise community. And there are resources that may become more available to you once you rise to that level of planning in your neighborhood. And for instance, you have a leader that gets you started, and you look at your immediate neighborhood or homeowners association, and what are the big threats and the vulnerabilities in our neighborhood, and what do we do about it? So Firewise is one way to do that. And the basic, fire science, or the fire triangle, what can we do to change fire behavior? And of course, we look at the basics. What does fire need? It needs fuel, it needs heat and oxygen. And of course, a firefighter can control oxygen and heat with water or other firefighting approaches. But out in the landscape in the forest, weather, topography, and again, the fuel, the trees and such, the brush, um, what can we control there? Well, we can only really control the fuel, the trees and the brush and the grass. So that's the common denominator. And then Do you have I would imagine most of you have homes or buildings on your lands. So a lot of it boils down to starting with the home. And nowadays we have to look at neighborhoods or homes as fuel. And in fact, that's one of the scary things about fires recently is that once they get into a community of buildings, it's the buildings that are the forest. It's burning. It's not the vegetation. In fact, sometimes the trees don't burn and the houses do, because once those houses start burning, they're a much higher fuel source, more volatile and explosive fuel than trees. And modern homes in particular are much more flammable. And a lot of times the reason the trees got burned is because the house burned and it got so hot, then it burned the trees once the fire starts racing through a subdivision. So we want to start there. If you have a home or a building in the woods, then you start with the home and say, well, what do we do to make it more fireproof or less likely to ignite? And there are some great videos that I want to refer you to that you really should watch in my references about that. And the number one cause of houses igniting is not vegetation burning too close to the home. It's the embers that are being blown by the wind, and then the embers find their way to the vulnerable parts of the house, the corners of the house where the leaves may have accumulated, the rain gutters, the roof, something under the house, etc. So it's pretty easy to reduce the hazard from direct flame just by moving trees and brush a little bit away from the house, and you only need to go about 30 feet. But it's the embers that are the main vulnerability. So that's the first point of inspection, which we'll get into, is look at the buildings and say, what can we do to change its vulnerability to embers? And they usually, again, it's a seasonal thing. It's just sort of like when you winterize, things getting ready for winter. Well, you need to summarize your fuel hazards and make sure the leaves and the wooden things are not close to the house and that they're raked up and cleaned up, pruning all the dead stuff out of vegetation near the house. Um, and then making sure that your screens and your attics and things under the house aren't going to be a place where embers can come in and start a fire. And when you look at the buildings that burned, in our recent fires here, you can see, well, why didn't that one burn? Now, there can be just a lot of bad luck, and no matter what, that house would burn. But a lot of times the difference is what were the vulnerabilities of that building versus the neighbors that didn't burn.
I can think of a few trees you probably should have had cut me on them. I didn't even think about that.
So then we start, with the whole, what we call the home ignition zone. And we should all become familiar with that. And defensible space, meaning that an area that is safe for a firefighter to go into to further defend your home, so that they don't have to, cut brush or move things around the house to make it safe. If you've done all that in advance and the fire is getting close, you leave, the firefighters come in and they can take a stand. It also means that when fire gets into that zone, it's just less likely to burn um, up close to the house and cause any kind of more direct heat or flame. So that zone where changes in your practice will make it defensible and also reduce the amount of heat that would occur. And there's a couple different ways we look at it, but it's I'll get into that, whether it's you draw circles or you just look at more of the rectangular spaces that our buildings would make. So you start with the home itself and everything that encircles it or touches it. We look at 30 feet out from that, because basically live fire further than 30 feet out does not really threaten the home from direct flame or heat. Um, and so you look at fire resistant materials in the house. There's a whole checklist that we use to look at a house and rate it and identify the things that need to be changed. Or if you're building a new home, the design that you would use so that it's going to be resistant, and it makes all the difference. Um, you know, metal roofs instead of wood roofs, etc. Windows can be important, double pane windows that insulate from heat through the windows. And again, reducing ember intrusion, cleaning gutters, etc. And then you look at the vegetation, and it's not that you have no vegetation. It doesn't all have to be paved or rock or bare dirt, but that things are kept green, they're kept low, that you avoid those really resinous flammable plants like cedars and junipers and things like that. And you keep the dead wood out and clean up the stuff right next to the house. Those basics, not having firewood. And then keeping it green and watered, that during the summer, that can really help in that first 30 feet. And actually the immediate zone, the first 5 feet is really important, right next to the house that might get up against it. And we have some guidelines on the fire resistant plants that are out there. Uh, they're suitable for home landscapes. If you get further out, that 30 to 100-foot zone, you look at just spacing the vegetation apart. It's not that you need again, a moonscape or devoid of vegetation, but you separate the fields so there's not continuous fields, that you prune things up. Trees might be 20 or 30 feet apart, or clumps of trees. And even if a clump is there and it's flammable, it can burn by itself and then it won't spread because it's disconnected. Pruning things up 10 feet off the ground, again, keeping things green. You go further out, then you get less, worried about that. You still could be thinning things out and having a more regular management cycle there. If you don't keep at it, though, if you don't maintain it, then it becomes more like the wild woods, and then it's really hard to maintain that. So that's a high maintenance situation in these home ignition zones. It's not something you can do on 100 acres. So when you look at the, more into the wildlands out 100 feet or more, then we're just wanting to change the way fire behaves. We're not trying to, we don't expect that it won't burn at all. It's just that when fire comes, it's going to not spread so fast. It won't be as intense. It won't be a crown fire. It would be a ground fire. So really make it less inviting to fire and more inviting to firefighters to go through that zone and get close to the home to protect it. And then, the basic practices are just reducing the surface fuel, keeping it down. Now, again, in a wildland, there's a trade-off there. A dense forest canopy will keep the ground vegetation down. If you open the forest canopy up and separate the tree crowns, then there's a lot more daylight and a lot more brush that grows. So there's kind of a trade-off deeper in the woods, away from the home ignition zone when you get further out, where you want to change the way fire moves through the stand. Keeping a denser canopy actually can be helpful to reduce ground fuel. Separating the ground fuel from the trees, so pruning the trees up so that whatever burns on the ground doesn't jump into the crowns of the trees. And also separating the horizontal distance between the crowns, spacing them out more. And then if you look at kind of an extreme example of a brushy, overgrown woodland in a more dry forest situation like this with manzanita and pine and oak, before and after, again, you reduce the amount of fuel on the ground, you reduce the ladder fuels to the trees, you keep your height to the crown base by pruning up, and you separate the tree crowns so that it can't spread from crown to crown. You keep your larger trees that are more resistant to fire. So that would be an example before and after. Now we talk a lot about thinning, which would be a way to separate the tree crowns, but then the trade-off with thinning is if you thin heavily, like we see at the top here, you let a lot of daylight in, and then you're going to have a lot more vigorous growth of your ground fuel. And so more and more in the west side in particular, where things are growing so fast, a good strategy in the woods might be to keep a fairly dense canopy, thin it enough for the trees to be vigorous and have healthy crowns, but keep the ground vegetation much lower. Because thinning it too much, then you have a higher maintenance of ground fuel. You're going to have to get out there, and maybe you don't want to do that on larger acreages. So what we'd call a shaded fuel break is a good way to keep ground fuels low with a moderately dense canopy, and just don't expect the fire ever to get into the crowns. And thinning those smaller trees, leaving the larger fire resistant trees, that kind of mimics what happens in natural stands, because those large trees are more fire resistant. Especially with Doug fir and pine, and those main species there have thicker bark, and they actually resist being killed by fire because the bark insulates the cambium. The pruning is a more active process, of course, to reduce the connection between the ground fuel and the canopy. 8 to 10 feet is usually kind of a minimum that we look at. And there's a lot of guidelines about pruning that are important. Need to maybe have a whole class on that, but you want to be careful not to prune conifers, especially Doug fir and pine, in the spring and summer. So if you're pruning them anytime after February through July or August, they're vulnerable to sap bleeding and pitch moths that get in there and make kind of chronic, ugly um, uh, infestations of the right around the pruning wound. So it's good to prune the conifers in the fall and winter. And now if you're pruning dead branches, that doesn't matter so much, but if you're pruning green branches, that causes a lot more of that sap problem. Of course, then that's going to make a lot of slash, both the thinning and the pruning is going to make slash, but again, it's effective at separating the ground fuel. So then of course, the whole challenge with fuels reduction, especially here on the west side where things grow so fast, is it's a constant kind of process if you want to keep that home ignition zone fairly clear. And how do you deal with the debris and do that safely? And unfortunately, the burn piles, the debris piles, are one of the #1 causes of human caused ignitions around here. And so doing that properly is important. Now, of course, a lot of what you could do is utilize as much of the cuttings as you can, larger pieces. You can also just cut things and scatter them and get them in contact with the ground in smaller pieces. And that's a reasonable way to take care of light fuels, piling and burning, masticating with the machine, chipping it, or just hauling it away. For your neighborhood fuels reduction day with the big dumpster or pile that someone's going to come chip at a hub site. These machines, these mastication machines, are actually becoming more available, and they can take down even small trees and brush or blackberries and Scotch broom and chop them up into little fragments. So on the left side is someone had thinned and had a lot of their slash in between the trees, and then they hired this machine to come through and chop it all up. That only, of course, works on level or nicer ground, not much of a slope and not too up and down or rocky. Um, but then just kind of common sense about the different kinds of vegetation and what carries a flame, and tall grass being a real formula for a rapid movement of fire with a fairly high flame length and a rapid rate of spread. If you kept it mowed and just light fuels on the ground, your flame lengths are way down and it spreads much more slowly, and of course won't be as hot when it reaches some new fuel type. One of the big questions that a lot of people ask is, well, I don't want to have an ugly cleared landscape. I want to have nice plants and landscaping. And you can have a good, pretty landscape, but you do it strategically. You might have your higher hazard fuels in clumps that are well separated from other things in case fire comes. Or you just may have sacrificial patches where I'm going to let that little patch be really nice and dense and not worry if it burns, as long as it's far enough away from and with enough fuels treatment in between. And looking at some of the places that have burned, um, the forest is very close to this house. This was in the North Fork Santiam, and that house did not burn, even with that forest behind it. That forest was really more of a ground fire, although it started to heat up enough to scorch the crowns. But the home didn't burn, and right next to it, uh, was one that did. And so, what's the difference between these two? um, you know, hard to say exactly after the fact, but I suspect that this one, the burn, just had more vulnerabilities to embers, whereas this one that was obviously getting a lot of embers just, was a little bit more less vulnerable to those embers. So those are the things that ahead of time we can plan to make the home, that structure, less vulnerable. Similar in this case, with a fairly tall, dense canopy, the ground fuel was fairly light. The fire did burn through and scorch the trees, and those trees are pretty close to that home. But the home was not that very vulnerable to the ember showers that it experienced, because it was fairly clean around it and didn't have a lot of ways for embers to get in there. So, to get help with this is really, where do you start? Again, we have a lot of guidelines and resources that I'm giving you that you should just read and start looking at your own property with those guidelines in mind. But you can get assistance again from Department of Forestry, Natural Resource Conservation Service, your fire department, and of course Extension. And then grants, I think there's going to be an increase in the amount of effort and funding to help communities do this kind of fuels reduction. And if you and your community have a plan and you're ready to sign up for these opportunities, then you're going to be higher up in the order, first in line, if you have a good plan and you've got it together. So the main thing is just take a look at your situation and get help where you need it. Study some of these materials and get started reducing hazards, assessing your hazards and seeing what you might be able to reduce on your own. and look at these, hazard reduction programs, but realize that it's going to be a kind of a constant process. It's going to take periodic attention, seasonal attention, to cleaning up hazards, as well as periodic attention in the woods where there's a lot more vegetation to deal with. And if you're really fired up, you can become a leader and make your community, one of those FireWise communities that is going to get some funding and do a lot more at the larger scale. So that's that on the fire kind of preparedness. And ready for questions.
So we didn't have any questions actually in our chat box, but if folks have a question, if you just want to unmute yourself, yeah, we'd love to hear it.
And anything goes. You can talk about fire recovery too if you want, because I'm up to my neck in that as well. Well, I have to say, if you've been on this for 3 hours, just definitely take some time and watch some of those videos and study this when you're feeling up to it, because obviously it's really an important topic and will be more so as time goes by with fire hazards. I will say that if any of you are affected by the fires and haven't connected with help or trying to decide what to do, it'd be really important to, check with me or look at our or OSU fire program material. And particularly one thing, if you're looking for tree seedlings to plant, I think I mentioned that, it's going to be hard to find seedlings because of the great demand. And we are developing a program with Department of Forestry and through OSU where we're trying to get everyone on the list who needs trees and has not been able to get them. And I'd like you to email me and I'll send you a little survey that'll put you on the list. Right now I have about 250 landowners that have contacted me from across the burned areas in Oregon, and their demand for trees is at about 4.5 million.
Holy cow.
And the industry is estimating 100 million are needed. So that means it's hard for a little guy to go out and get 5,000 trees because the nurseries are completely, booked and a lot of demand. So we're creating kind of new supplies, and our best effort to order trees this year, we were able to order 450,000. And the need I have on my list again is over 4 million. So we're going to take a few years to catch up, and we need to take, time and realize that nature would take decades to recover from this fire. And if it takes us 5 years to get enough trees to help people plant, that's not too bad. But we're not going to get them this year or next year. It's going to take longer to get enough for everybody. But if you need help with that, let me know, because we can put you on the list.
So we do have a question from Lenny, who is managing property that did burn, and she's asking if there are groups to learn from. About the fire issues in the area. They have land under an acre,
Okay.
And the house burned as well. So
yeah, I mean, I think there are a variety of different groups. Certainly through, again, what I'm doing with OSU, anybody who calls or gets on our list or shows up at a webinar, it's a start. We also do field visits. We've done some neighborhood visits where we, like if someone invites me to the Santiam Canyon or to Lions, and I'd like to say, well, talk to your neighbors, let's get people together. And with COVID times, I can show up and everybody wears masks and we stay at a distance and we can look at things and talk about things. So that's one way for a group sort of a situation. I was actually, what is needed is for communities to work together, because it's your neighborhood, the access, the ingress and egress, your neighbor's trees as well as your trees or shrubs. So getting community groups together to share and learn is good. And also when it comes to the restoration part, like if we can get landowners to team up, let's say that, 5 different landowners in an area need a total of, 5,000 trees, and no one of them wants to hire a tree planter, and a tree planter doesn't want to come out just to plant 500 trees. Usually they come in crews and they plant thousands. So not that you couldn't find a tree planter to do a few, but there just aren't as many out there. Maybe through your neighborhood, you find out, hey, we know somebody who will plant 500 trees. Okay, or can I hire them to plant another 500? You know, talk to each other, connect with each other, share resources and lessons learned. And I'd be happy to help facilitate some of that, you know, when I can get to it. I am a limited resource, but there are others like me too. And we also have some volunteers. In fact, you know, that's our approach, especially for some of the smaller acres landowners that don't know where to start. A phone call. And we have volunteers that are trained foresters that are lining up and that I can connect. So even if I am overwhelmed with the emails and phone calls, we know this is going to take a while, and we're developing more volunteer help with that. So anyway, get in touch.
Excellent. Before we started the conversation today, we had someone asking about whether, because of the damage to a lot of Doug firs that is happening, especially on the North Santiam and around the valley, whether you're recommending people not plant Doug firs?
I mean, that's a good question. Kind of, I think we were talking about this earlier, you know, in the context of climate change, but Douglas fir is, you know, the most abundant tree in Western Oregon for a reason. 100 years ago, it was 60% of the forest from early surveys, and now it's about the same. It's a real diverse, adapted, genetically diverse tree. It's a real survivor. So I would not discriminate against Douglas fir. If it grew there before, it probably could grow there again, except for some of those sites that are maybe at the margin where it's a little warmer and drier, and maybe, you know, oak and valley pine might be more suited. You know, maybe the more subtle question is, which Douglas fir? Do we plant the one from a little further south? But I wouldn't steer clear of Douglas fir because it's a fire adapted tree. It's for 6,000 years, Douglas fir forests have been growing up, burning down, and growing up again. It's a fire adapted, fire driven forest type.
Excellent. I think that's about it on the questions. Does anyone have anything else they want to ask of Glenn or Karen? Karen is still here. Karen, are you?
I am
on?
still here. Yeah, I'm still
Great.
here. And there was a question in the chat about if there was assistance to landowners that wanted to replace a culvert. And the answer to that is yes. I'm not sure who asked it, but the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, for the less expensive culverts, there's a small landowner program. And for the more expensive culverts and bridges, there's the larger restoration grants. So your best, my best suggestion is to contact your local watershed council, which would be the North Santiam or the Pudding. And that's your best avenue. The OWEB process can be a bit complicated, and so it's always good to have somebody with experience who's got those grants through before. But that's probably that's a lion's share of a lot of the restoration, in-stream restoration that OWEB funds is culvert upgrades and associated. Typically, a landowner will come in with a project to replace a culvert and do riparian plantings and do some large wood structures, kind of a holistic project to restore their particular section of the creek. So if there's any other questions about fish or fire and fish and how the fires might affect the fish in the North Santiam River, I'm happy to entertain those as well.
Well, we can meet again. And I again encourage you to look for Tree School online. We have a lot of different classes there. One of our classes is a landowner that personally took responsibility to enhance about 3 miles of stream, including replacing culverts with bridges and doing log placements. And he has some great videos about the salmon that just came back to spawn. So that's always good. And you can make a difference in fire behavior with a lot of attention to changing the field conditions around your home and in your woods. So